Chapter 15. Her twin Katrina and Jimmy flew down together, enjoying a sense of comradeship and giggling about the state of Jimmy's overnight bag, which had disturbed a flight full of people because at the last moment he had discovered it contained rotting foodstuffs from months before. For someone who claimed to have been in the army, he certainly was never concerned with keeping his kit or anything else tidy. Apparently it was hard to get him into the taxi on time because of his usual lack of concern for the time, but they were both in good spirits when they arrived. Katrina was entitled to a night of cheap accommodation at the Crowne Plaza Hotel, as she was working for the company at the time. Julia would join them, and they would spend one night at the plaza and then move on to a cheaper motel room for the following 2 nights, as the girls were sharing the expenses between them. There was not sufficient accommodation for me in the one room, so I would remain at the charity house, but they would be able to use my car and I could catch the train home. The previous day, a surgeon had removed one of Julia's tumours, a small one, from high up her side towards the shoulder blade. She had really hoped that the doctors might take one of the beasts, so she could lie comfortably on her back. However, their removal would require a general anaesthetic, which was not permitted on the trial. The surgeon allowed me to join Julia for the procedure, and we chatted about the value of white noise as a tool for aiding study, while Julia struggled with it all. At one point she cried, so rare for her, and then hurriedly apologised for her tears. We drove to the plaza to meet them, any thoughts of yesterday's surgery dissipated by their arrival. Jimmy was pleased to see her. He had brought 2 greenstones, one for him and one for her, a pendant to be worn at the throat, a stone to bind them together. That evening we planned to eat dinner at a local restaurant. Katrina and I left them alone for a couple of hours, and then we all met for a drink at the pub, and Jimmy detailed his ideas for a book he would one day write. It would explore the theme of archangels and their integration with we mortals here on earth. By now we had worked out the time for fasting and the time for eating, and it was a small opportunity in time. The western suburbs of Sydney were new to Katrina, and there was a sense of adventure in our outing, but mainly Katrina was just glad to be with her sister. We sat eating our alfresco meal, the first of the diners, in order to fit in with Julia's routine. But the moment was spoiled by Julia's irritation, complaining because Jimmy would not eat all the meal she was paying for, knowing that afterwards he would demand to fill his stomach with junk food. She found it so ungracious, his lack of gratefulness. I met them again the next day, when a trip to the city of Sydney had been planned. Julia had not had a good night, and in fact complained that Jimmy had taken over their shared bed without any regard for her wounds or her pain. Katrina confirmed that she had spent the night listening to Julia's complaints, but Jimmy didn't seem to be perturbed in any way. Julia was not up for the trip, and Katrina and I decided to make the journey together, leaving the 2 of them alone. Katrina was disappointed. She would gladly have forfeited the city trip to spend the time with Julia, but I consoled her with the notion that neither of us could give Julia what she needed from Jimmy. They came in on the train in the evening to meet us at Chinatown. Katrina had also arranged to catch up with a friend that she had worked and travelled with in the Middle East, and Julia wanted to shout us all dinner. Once again, the timing had to be right to fit in with the medication. We selected a meal and ordered. That time was running short, and Julia ate a little and felt unwell enough to continue. So she paid the bill and with all her charm wished us good night. Jimmy took her off into the night to catch the train back to the motel room. I was glad of his size and his strength, comforted by the notion that he would be able to look after her. I wasn't there in that motel room, not there to make my observations. But she complained the next day that he had no notion of how to sit at a meal and share, no notion or idea of ordering and sharing each dish with the others at the table. I don't know why she was so displeased with him. I would have attributed his behaviour to a lack of exposure to the protocols in a Chinese restaurant. But she certainly viewed it as a deficit. "He doesn't know how to share," she said, her face screwed up with the distaste of it. We had another attempt at a meal the following evening in one of the curry restaurants that abound in the district. I spent the day with Katrina and her travelling mate and once again joined Jimmy and Julia at the restaurant. She was unable to eat the meal, but determined that our evening should not be spoiled, retired to sit in the car. We finished our meals, knowing that is what she wanted, but each of us was so aware of the reality of the situation, each playing the part of the invited guest, unwilling to disturb our host. The only relief from the evening was the waiter, who set out to impress us, but instead amused us when he dropped a tray full of plates. Katrina's tension evaporated into laughter. I was to have many more meals with Julia, in which she dismissed the fact of her illness, determined that life was unaltered. Her favourite cuisine, but the very last time she would ever attempt all those spices. Katrina and Jimmy had one more day and were to fly out mid-afternoon after their 10 o'clock check-out from the motel. So we decided on a picnic so that Julia could rest as we passed the time together. Before Katrina and Jimmy's arrival in Sydney, I had emptied the back seat of the car into our little room so that the car would accommodate us all. I walked up to the shops and bought the food from the Lebanese shop where the young man behind the counter had made his attraction to Julia so clear on a previous visit for breakfast. Jimmy was driving, and it was a relief to have someone else to take control of the car. He set the tom-tom for the park and we set off into the heavy traffic. I don't know what induced him to stop on a corner in the midst of the stream of traffic in the middle of the city. But he spent so much time fiddling with the tom-tom that the driver behind him lost his temper. It was an ugly response from Jimmy, total lack of control, road rage in fact, and I thought for one moment that he was going to ram my car into the other driver. Yelling abuse, hard language, and no thought of anything but his own anger. It was only Julia who pulled him up, a voice of reason, pointing out that her mother and her sister were in the back, and it was her mother's car. The entrance to the park was only around the corner, and it was such a relief to get out of that vehicle. She pointed out that in fact he was in the wrong. He had stopped in city traffic. So he dumped us all and disappeared for the entire duration of the picnic. Went off with his mobile phone glued to his ear, a long-distance call to his brother in New Zealand. It was then that I'd learned the reason for her irritation with him. He had not paid the rent or any other bills with the $800 she had sent. Instead, she was now bound by a green stone around her neck, paid for her, by her. The phone, glued to his ear, was another of her burdens. When he returned, he refused to eat, so we had to dump his meal. Julia, appalled by his manners, we'd all done it too tough too often to throw food in the bin. He had apparently had a haircut and paid the barber twice the price, advertising enjoying his own benevolence. But Julia pointed out who was paying, and he didn't like that, complaining that she had tipped the waiter at the curry shop. He just did not see it the way we did not see that it was not his money to spend, a different view to ours. We had to go to the bank before he went home so that Julia could give him more money because the rent had to be paid. She hobbled in as Jimmy waited on the footpath. And then an argument. Katrina and I sat in the car immobilised by the moment. He abused her, yelled out loud, not a brief moment, but prolonged, a war zone on the footpath, as she handed him over the money. He couldn't accept her reluctance to just hand over the money without her disapproval of the situation. Katrina, white-faced and frozen by the shock. "We don't deserve this," is all she could mutter, and it was indeed one of those defining moments that make one question how much is enough. Katrina had to travel home with him on the long journey by train then plane. He said not a word to her throughout the journey, but used some of Julia's money to purchase a book at the airport.